I'm not saying that I encountered overt racism on the part of the proponents of Project Chariot. People were more or less polite and more or less respectful outwardly. But it's hard to believe that at some level, the Native people weren't being taken advantage of because they were Native people. I think that's kind of impossible not to be the case.
Welcome to the East Anchorage Book Club podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Gray. In the late 1950s, the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission initiated Operation Plowshare, which was a research project designed to find peaceful uses for nuclear explosives. Edward Teller, known as the father of the hydrogen bomb, championed the first big project of Operation Plowshare, which was to blast a deep-sea harbor near Cape Thompson, Alaska, by detonating a series of nuclear bombs simultaneously. This proposal was known as Project Chariot. What the proponents of this plan insisted was that it was safe and would bring economic prosperity to Alaska. Edward Teller and his staff told Alaskans all over the state, again and again, that there would not be any lasting harm to Northwest Alaska from their project. And it would especially not be of harm to the people of Point Hope, who lived just 30 miles from ground zero of the planned harbor. The truth is, if Project Chariot were to have been carried out, it could have resulted in radiation exposure equivalent to 675 Chernobyl disasters. In his 1995 book, The Firecracker Boys, Fairbanks author Dan O'Neill documents in riveting detail how the Atomic Energy Commission, hereafter referred to as the AEC, misled the Alaskan public, and how a group of concerned scientists, and most importantly, the Inupiat people of Point Hope themselves, successfully fought back the U.S. government from conducting an atomic experiment that would have resulted in lasting nuclear devastation to our great state.
Dan O'Neill, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Andrew. Good to see you.
For listeners who may not have read The Firecracker Boys, I just want to tell them up front that it is an amazing book that they need to read, and that there's no way we're going to be able to summarize the vast amount of material that is covered in the book. I really, really mean it when I say it, that every page has a fascinating, interesting fact that we could spend a lot of time talking about. And I think that you talk about it in your acknowledgments at the end, that you had over 1,000 hours of interviews, I think.
1,000 pages anyway of transcribed interviews, yeah.
So it was a lot of material, and I definitely want to talk about how you decided what to include and what not. But this started off as a television project, is that correct?
Yeah. Well, I got real interested in the story, and I had training, some academic training in writing, but I found I couldn't get funded to write a book. But I could get funded, for no really good reason, to make a film. And so, for instance, the Alaska Humanities Forum, which is passed through National Endowment for the Humanities money, wouldn't pay somebody to write a book, but they would pay them to make a movie. So I didn't think it made much sense, but I thought, well, what the hell, I'll make a movie.
Had you made a movie before?
And let's see. Yeah, I had made both radio and television documentaries. I wasn't trained in that either, but I had done it, and it's lots of fun. And so anyway, I thought, well, I could start with a film and do the research I need to do for the book, making the film. And so that's what I proposed.
And this was late 80s?
Yes. And I collaborated with the public radio station at University of Alaska, Fairbanks, KOAC. And they said, yeah, sure, they'd put up, a camera guy and the editing stuff, and I could kind of manage the rest, what we would shoot and how it would go together on paper, essentially, and have some technical person put it together. And So I applied for a pretty big fat grant in those days, and I got it. And I was, so excited. And then as other managers at the radio station took a look at the proposal and balked. And what they were worried about was that it was during an era of budget cuts in the university, and they were worried about their budget, and the film had the potential to alienate, most particularly, William Wood, who had been a past president at UAM, and then it was the whole system, and was still an influential civic figure in Fairbanks, still had a lot of allies on campus. And this, the story I was coming up with didn't show him in a very flattering light. Sorry. And so they decided they didn't want to do this film to protect their funding. And, so the irony was that one of the main reasons to make the film was to talk about academic freedom and censorship. And they weren't getting the basic message of why we were even doing this. So they bailed. They bailed at the last minute. I thought I might have to get my grant back. And I called up Gary Holthouse, who ran the Humanities Forum then. He and one other person, they ran the whole show. And they put money out there for researchers to do work. And they were really wonderful. Anyway, I said, Gary, I can't produce what I said I was going to produce. What do you want me to do? And his exact words were, "What's your pleasure?" And I never really had anybody trust me so much because I was pretty unproven. And it so touched me, that I made sure he got every nickel worth on that grant. I did a lot. I went a lot of places. I went a lot more places because I was unencumbered by a film crew. And, I slept at the 34th Street YMCA in New York City, on couches here and there, and cheap old places all over the country and Canada. Anyway, I was able to amass a big wad of archival material, and that's what I told them I would do. I would create an archival collection of films, photographs, audio recordings, oral history recordings I would make, people's personal correspondence, they'd give them to me, government documents, clippings, everything. And I would make this available to any researcher who came to the archive. In the end, that's what I did to satisfy that grant.
I'll just say, because so many of our listeners go to my church, Gary Holthouse was the head pastor at the Anchorage Unitarian Universalist Fellowship, which is where I belong. It's very, he passed away fairly recently. And we loved Gary. So
he was a really special guy, I think, and just the guy in the right job. He just turned you loose, gave you the trust, and I think a lot was done during his tenure.
For our listeners who haven't read the book, and I'm going to throw this out there. Obviously, I am a newly elected legislator. I just had a new legislator orientation with lots of freshman legislators. I told some of the new folks from Fairbanks that I was going to be interviewing you about this. I won't name their names, but they didn't know what Project Chariot was. So there are people out there who don't know what Project Chariot was. So I feel like before we could start talking about this book, we probably need to give a thumbnail sketch of what was Project Chariot.
Yeah. So, well, even if it sounds immodest of me to say, it's kind of hard to believe that someone at the level of the state legislature wouldn't be aware of this aspect of our history, because it ends up a mighty important part of our story in Alaska. But it's in a nutshell, in 1958, Edward Teller, so-called father of the H-bomb, working with weapons laboratories and the Atomic Energy Commission, came to Alaska and proposed creating an instant harbor on the northwest coast of Alaska by burying and detonating a string of thermonuclear bombs. An enormous wallop, like 40% of all the firepower expended in World War II, touched off in an instant, while billions of cubic yards of earth would have been thrown as high as the stratosphere, and a great big hole created on the coast that the sea would rush in and create this instant harbor. Well, obviously, the radiation hazard would have been enormous, and there was a village, Point Hope, about 30 miles away, that in the original configuration, which was going to be 2.4 megatons or 2.4 million tons of TNT equivalent, it would have probably knocked that village down. So they were very cavalier. They brought quite a bit of scientific hubris aboard when they approached Alaska and told people they could handle anything. They could blast a harbor in the shape of a polar bear if required. If your mountain's not in the right place, drop us a card. These were things they said. 1958, Cold War. Well, the war had been won with the bomb, and so they had a lot of cockiness and confidence at the time, much of it not borne out by scientific reality. And to their great credit, a lot of the University of Alaska biologists in particular fought back, pushed back, and said, you're making claims that are not borne out by what's published in the literature, which is the way science is supposed to operate. So these were scientists, physicists, not behaving like scientists, more like public relations people. They were pushing a project like boosters do. And of course, we had a lot of boosters in Alaska, especially just with new statehood. Wanted federal dollars. They spent up here, jobs for people, put Alaska on the map, all these kind of slogans we still hear today, engendered a lot of support across the board for Project Chariot.
I think there were a lot of people who wanted the claims that this was a safe project to be true. From newspaper reporters to politicians all across the state, to other academics. So it really was an issue of people really, really wanting something to be true, even though I think common sense wise, it seemed too good to be true.
Yeah. Everybody wants money easy, the easy way. And, but the obligation of people in public office, people at universities, and even church leaders who are supporting this is not to be suckered by grand claims, but to do your homework. And so it was endorsed everywhere at the legislature, at every chamber of commerce from Kotzebue to Ketchikan. Mm-hmm. Church, as I say, and the university led by William R. Wood was behind it officially. And a lot of the critics then grew up both within the university biologist groups, but also what we then call conservationists, which would become environmentalists really as a result of their opposition to Chariot. It changed the face of the nature of protection of wild spaces as a result of considering Project Chariot. But also, I was going to say, a great deal of important opposition came from the native people of Point Hope as well. So these groups, they were pretty grassrootsy, were officialdom, nevertheless coalesced and worked together and ultimately brought about the end of this proposal.
Right. And I think something to point out is that Teller went on a publicity tour where he was basically marketing this as the reason why he wanted a deep sea harbor here is that they were going to do coal mining, and that this would give an opportunity this was prior to the discovery of oil at Prudhoe Bay. This was going to be a resource that Alaskans could make money off of. But of course, as you do such a great job of pointing out in the book, if there really was a lot of coal to be mined, it was going to be on the other side of the Brooks Range. It was, and that it was going to be an extraordinarily expensive proposition to mine this coal. He said they were going to build a railroad to carry it to the harbor. It just, for business people, they were asking questions about how this was going to pencil out, and it didn't pencil out. And I think that's where you do such a great job of pointing out the reason why Teller wanted to do this is they wanted to do an experiment. They wanted to experiment and see if they could use nuclear bombs to do good things.
Well, yeah. So the basic question is, why did they want to do this? And I think the answer has lots of levels. Well, officially, what they told people when they came up and promoted the project was that we could make a harbor up there where one is needed. So that they said that commercial fishing in the area was retarded because of lack of a safe harbor. And they also said there were big deposits of coal nearby that would be of economic benefit to the region. Well, neither thing was true. There really aren't any commercially exploitable fish stocks up around there. And the coal in question was, like you say, on the other side of the Brooks Range. And the idea of building a railroad, which they said they could do across Arctic tundra for hundreds of miles, and then to take it to a harbor that's ice locked for 8-9 months of the year, made no economic sense. So when certain, not every, but certain people pointed out the economic reality, they kind of shifted and said, it'll be a very useful experiment for our nuclear program of beating the nuclear sword into a peacetime tool. We want to use these explosives for good, in peacetime. And so then it became a physics experiment, and they wanted to learn things about the depth of burial of yields of different sizes would create craters of different sizes, and also release varying amounts of radiation. So how could you make the biggest hole or the smallest charge and release the least radiation? All useful things to know, but the real, some of the other reasons that were at play was that there was a nuclear test ban treaty afoot, and many people around the world wanted to end, particularly atmospheric test ban, but all nuclear tests, because this radiation was going around the globe, and it was in people's food, it was in every body, it was in every single living organism on the planet, radionuclides that did not exist other than in nuclear explosions. So there was a lot of worry about it, and the people like Teller and the radiation laboratories and the Atomic Energy Commission did not want a test ban. They wanted to keep improving their weapons. But by selling it under the rubric of peaceful use, they hoped they would be able to refine the explosive power of their devices. They wouldn't call them bombs, but devices, but really be extending their knowledge of weaponry at the same time. Plus, it would keep the laboratories staffed and funded and working.
Right. And they were constantly emphasizing how safe this would be, how little radiation exposure plants, animals, and potentially humans would have. And I think one of the ways that Alaskans were kind of calling them on the bluff, there were definitely people who said, hey, instead of doing it there, why don't we do it someplace more useful? But it seems that the main reason why Project Chariot needed to happen near Point Hope was because these scientists who did not live or work in Alaska believed that there was really no one there, that there weren't any people or animals or anything to be harmed, because they really didn't know how much radiation would be released. And so they thought this would be a good place to experiment, but they didn't want to say that. And so when people would say, well, hey, why don't we use it I don't know, somewhere more useful, further south in Alaska. I mean, am I wrong there?
Well, I think I credit them with a little more, a little more savvy than that summary. I think that, if you were a believer in this technology and thought that you had a chance to control radiation release to minimally unsafe levels, where would you do it? Well, you certainly would start at a very remote place because, after all, it's an experiment, so you don't really know how it's going to come out. So it's true that their blanket assurances of safety were bunk. They did not know these things, and that's why they were interested in getting the scaling information. So I think if you were to look, and the other thing was, they wanted ultimately perhaps to do grand projects around the world, including a sea-level Panama Canal, to bury them in a row, blow out a canal, and repeat all the way across the isthmus, which would have been a catastrophic release of radiation. But in any case, before you started to export this technology to other countries, you wanted to show you did it in your own place, or it would be a harder sell. So if you figure remote and American soil, you're already in Alaska. And then they looked for a place, a stretch of coastline that didn't have a harbor. And that's true up there. Nome on up there's no good harbors. Nome could have used one more, but a bigger population there. So I think they were direct, and they knew there were villages there. They went to USGS over in Menlo Park, across the bay, San Francisco Bay Area, and engaged Dave Hopkins, among others, who we talked about last time, and to help them try to find a suitable place to do this. So they were charged to find areas that were remote, didn't have deep harbor, that the geology might permit such a construction, and wasn't too close to villages. So they had that input. But I do feel, too, that there was a political reason to go way up there. Whether or not they ever said this to themselves, I don't know. I never found it. But certainly they were going to face, they would be likely to figure they would face less opposition in an area that was sparsely populated by an indigenous group primarily, not uniformly proficient in English, pretty not terribly conversant with nuclear technologies. Just in most every which way you would look at it, they apparently lacked political clout. It turned out that they were people who point, were very determined and very savvy and accomplished a great deal. But I think it might have been part of their reasoning that it'd be a whole lot easier to do that than in some lonely stretch of Maine or Northern California.
Right. Let's go there. I feel like one of the most important parts of the books is where they are doing their tour around Alaska to present a very positive spin on Project Chariot. And they go to Point Hope. And so it is in, I guess it is around page 133 on chapter 9, where they do their first presentation to the people of Point Hope. And I guess I want to ask you just about the absolute amazing work that you have here of being able to quote so many villagers. How did you do it?
Yeah. I'm really delighted you're zeroing in on that, because I just recently read some of my notes that it took me 5 years to get that information to where I felt it was solid. And I just wrote a little paper for the Alaska History Journal on finding them on this very thing. So look for that information. But anyway,
Well, just to tell listeners, I mean, you basically do the meeting in the book, and it's from the start, from them showing a short video to all the way through the pushback that happens. And a lot of it is happening in Inupiat and being translated in real time. I wondered if there was a recording, if you were going off of what, yeah.
So what I had originally was a document made by Don Foote, who was a major character in the book. And he was a white guy, went up there to study the native people's habits and food production stuff as part of the AEC study. And he became a very close ally of the native people, blah, blah, blah. Well, when the AEC boys went up there to do their little dog and pony show, the people set up tape recorders. And one of the guys was the minister set up one, and the native guy, Dan Lisburn, set up one. So I knew there were tapes in existence. Well, Foote had what he called a partial transcript or an excerpt of a transcript that he had made. And it was completely mind-blowing, damning of AEC personnel in that what they told the people there was just untrue. It was not only untrue as we know it now, it was untrue at the time. It was known to be untrue at the time. You could look at AEC's own publications before then to know that that's not what the agency felt was the effect of nuclear explosions on people, the effects of radiation on people, and so on. There was just a dozen or more major misstatements or statements that were untrue, that were presented to the Point Hope people concerning the safety of nuclear blast. However, and while I had that transcript, that was great, Foote was a partisan. Foote was opposed to Project Chariot. So he had a vested interest in maybe not representing what people said in full context. Plus, it was excerpts. Maybe he left out, this happened to me just today. The disclaimer I make is left out, and something I said is juxtaposed against something else to make it look like an endorsement, and I don't endorse. So anyway, that could have been done, and I don't know. And so I really wanted to use it because if it was accurate, it was just so damning. So I needed to find the damn tape. So then at one point I found a letter in Foote's collection. He had, I don't know how many, 40, 50, 60 boxes of stuff at the archives. And I found a letter that said the tape was being mailed to this guy in New Hampshire, and it had his address. So I started to look for this guy to see if he, A, was still alive, B, lived at the same address, C, he had the tape, and not just any tape, but this tape. And anyway, it started out a real long process, and just as I was going on that, somebody wrote me out of the blue, a judge from Yukon Territory who knew this man. And so then I got in touch with him. I think he at that point was in bad health, but his wife became my correspondent. And then there was several people back there in New Hampshire and Massachusetts who had worked against Chariot in the 60s, and they had kept records and they saved them. And this woman told me, I've got that tape. And I thought, well, I'm sure you have a tape, and I bet it isn't the tape. And so finally, and then I said, send it to me, and she said, oh, no, my son or my nephew's going to make a copy. And I thought, oh, no, just send me the original. Well, anyway, it took forever, but I finally got a cassette dub in really poor audio quality. But with the transcript in your hand and playing that, you can verify one with the other.
Like it was the meeting.
Foote's language, Foote's transcript was faithful. Mm-hmm. And what he didn't include, the things that were not included in his excerpts, were pretty immaterial. It was a fair reproduction of the whole thing. But now that I had the tape to confirm it, and in fact, then I began to use the transcript to help me understand the tape, and the tape is the original document now. And so I had really good authority on which to say they said those things.
right? So what I want to do is I'm going to really fast from page 160. And this was when you were writing about the Bikini Atoll and the hydrogen bomb testing that was happening, the nuclear bomb testing that was happening in the Marshall Islands area, where I just want, and I'm really wanting to give a perspective for the listeners that you're talking about how much potential radiation could be released from their plan, from the Project Chariot plan. On page 160, you say, if the prediction was accurate, the vented radiation of the Chariot explosions would be equivalent to between 314 to 675 Chernobyl disasters. So I want people to understand that, 675 Chernobyls happening. It's huge, just mind-bogglingly, enormously huge. But, so now I want to go to page 133, and I'm going to have you read some of this. So the AEC is doing a meeting where they're basically doing their dog and pony show that they've given all over the state to explain all of the great, wonderful things that this project is going to do for Alaska and how it is a very safe project. So knowing that it could be potentially hundreds of Chernobyls, they are presenting to Point Hope the same presentation they've given, and they're expecting the same sorts of questions that they've gotten. And so on page 133, it says, if you could start reading where it says, he was interrupted by a woman's voice.
He was interrupted by a woman's voice. Dinah Frankson, David's wife, who had great influence in the village because she was an Umalik's wife, spoke in Inupiat while Daniel Lisburn translated. The woman here mentioned all these people, most of them are just silent right now. They have great fear in this detonation and the effects and how the effects will be. Southwick was an AEC guy who could be a little slow on the uptake as internationally. No, here, said Lisburn. What? Asked Ball, another AEC guy. I don't quite get what her question was. The effect of the blast, explained Tommy Richards, the pilot. He was a half Eskimo guy from Kotzebue. The effect of the blast to the people? The effect of the blast to the people, echoed Lisburn. Dawn was breaking in Ball's mind. On your own Eskimo people? The audience looked back at him without speaking. Oh, well, I believe we've covered that already. I think we'll have to. Ball's voice trailed off as he turned to Richards to discuss their return flight to Kotzebue. I don't think that's true, said Richards. You haven't. Many people then spoke at once in Inupiat. Daniel Lisburn spoke for the people. I think, Mr. Ball, that the majority of us here right now have no understand what you have said previously, having not known enough about the English language. Lisburn said Dinah Frankson wanted to remind the AEC that she was a citizen of the United States and that she feared for the men who hunted in the Ogator Creek area, especially the seal hunters who, in April, went out on the sea ice near the planned Ground Zero. All the way down there? Asked Paul. Yeah, all the way down there, said Lisburn.
I think the point is that these people who are planning to do this enormous nuclear detonation have no idea what the people who live there do, or where they go, or what they eat, or how they live. And they're for the first time in real time learning that they actually go to the site where they're planning to detonate and that they would be there at the time of the detonation.
Typically, yeah. If they were to detonate in April, the people typically would have been out on the ice. And so they couldn't have been there if they were going to detonate in April. And they did typically hunt caribou at Ogator Creek, which the AEC didn't think was so. And they also collected those eggs in the summertime. So,
right. And I'll just throw out some more ridiculous stuff that comes up in this chapter where they're like, well, you won't be able to hunt or do anything on those days. But they literally are talking in terms of days and saying that we might compensate you for not hunting for a few days. Not understanding, but, not acknowledging that this would potentially be generations. Like that it was, yeah.
That it could have been like Bikini Island.
Yes.
Again, they moved the native people with the idea that they could move back, but they haven't since, and that's the 50s and 40s.
Right. Well, since you brought up Don Foote, can you give us a little sketch of Don Foote and what, how he played a role in all of this?
Sure. So his name was Don Charles Foote. It wasn't Donald, like so many people write. And through his father's line, he was Spaniard. He grew up back east, but the father was off the scene. The mother married someone he didn't get along with at all. And Foote was kind of farmed out to a military school, which he hated. And then he came back from that and said, I'm going to find my own place. And his parents said, fine, but you pay for it. And he did. He found his own prep school back east, got a scholarship, student body president, valedictorian, and captain of the baseball team, all that kind of guy. And super bright and energetic. And by the time he's working on his PhD in what they called human geography, which is a little bit like cultural anthropology, he was a pretty fierce defender of Native people, their way of life, and he became an important conduit to the people at Point Hope about what the AEC was up to. He got employed by the AEC to conduct studies of how they made their living. So he'd be running down the beach if anybody came in on their boat with a seal or a caribou or something, he'd go down and weigh it, measure it, and add all this stuff, which was very important then because you were able to say, in fact, how important Uvutora Creek, for example, was in the economy of the people. And he left a great record with all this kind of record-keeping, photographs, films, tape recordings, thousands and thousands of documents. It was a wonderful collection at the archives, and that's where I first got interested in the story, was in looking through his collection. And I had a kind of a personal affinity with him. I thought he was real energetic, real sharp, but an idealist and a fighter, and very careful in his research, in his argument. He was a data-driven person, basically applying scientific rigor to what he did. And all of that just spoke to me. So just the other day, I was reading, I picked up that transcript as I was working on a little paper and read his own notes, and I said half out loud, Don, it's good to hear from you again. I felt like I'd missed his voice, So anyway, but he died before I came along, came to Alaska just a couple of years before.
In somewhat mysterious circumstances, or at least controversial circumstances, or at least some people felt that there could have been foul play involved. I did want to talk about Don Foote's death.
Yeah. I don't know if you have that page, Mark, but
I probably do. As usual, when I underline things on every single page, it's not very helpful.
The story in brief is that Don was working for, I think it was Institute of Economic and Governmental Research at the time. And he was still a rabble-rouser in the North Slope.
And is that different than ICER, or is that what we call ICER today?
Yeah, I think it's the earlier name. I think so. And I think he was hired by Victor Fisher, in fact. And Wood wouldn't have him on the campus, but, or rather, within the university. I think he was on campus, but not affiliated. So he was still rabble-rousing about things like the North Slope oil development and so forth, when one night he gets in an automobile accident, hit head-on by a trooper. And he went to the hospital. People in I think it was a Volkswagen bus, they were all pretty well banged up, probably no seatbelt. And And Foote, though, seemed okay to his friends who visited him. And then after a day or two or three, all of a sudden he was dead. And people who went to visit were completely shocked because they said he looked okay and couldn't figure it out. So that, of course, occasions all kinds of conspiracy speculations that he was targeted. And I once asked a fellow who was in the car with them what he thought of that proposition. I mean, would you think that would be a reasonable way to take the guy out? And it turned out this fellow I was asking had himself been a CIA agent. So there was a CIA agent. I don't think I put it in the book because I didn't want to just be wanted. But there was a CIA agent, CIA in the vehicle with him. So anyway,
what did he think?
He didn't think it sounded like a really good method. No, it was icy road. Foote had been drinking. They had come from a bar downtown. They were going back to the campus, and everything was, typical winter, icy, dark situation. And it's just not inconceivable that you have an accident like that on little old college road.
Well, I'm going to read a sentence that you have on this page. Just a few months prior to his death, the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency was intercepting and copying Foote's mail. The agency acknowledges that it still has in its files a photocopy of Foote's correspondence from November 2nd, 1968. Though he had been dead 23 years at the time of the FOIA request, the CIA refused to disclose the document. So the fact that they wouldn't give you his documents, I think, is part of, like, as a reader, I think that there might be some there.
Well, you just can't tell with the goofy agencies. I mean, they classify stuff that has no value. It's not even embarrassing sometimes. You just can't explain what they're doing. And the way you can know that is that one agency will refuse you a particular document, and you'll get the same document through another agency, and then you know that the first guy is telling you you can't see 8 pages of something that the other guy gave you. And there's nothing in there that compromises national security or privacy or any of the other legitimate exclusion.
Right. Well, yeah, go ahead.
Let me just finish this off because at the point of it's something that has bugged me over the years, including just maybe a few weeks ago, I was speaking Zoom-wise with a history class, graduate history class at the University in Fairbanks. And one of the students asked, did I think he was off? And then I seemed to be saying it, she said, between the lines. And I said, I don't say anything between the lines. If I've got the goods, I say it right out loud. And if I don't, I'm not going to. So anyway, and then only later was I able to find the 2 places where I thought I had made clear that I have no evidence to suggest it was any kind of murder at all. But I felt it was my obligation to put out the stuff I had so that the next guy coming along, who might have 2 or 3 different but additional things, well, then maybe a picture is getting put together, but I'm not putting it together. I'm just saying what I know.
Well, I can say this as someone who works in the medical profession, that a massive pulmonary embolism is a reason, or I guess acute pulmonary edema. I may have actually misread it. Now I'm looking at it. Maybe it wasn't a massive pulmonary embolism. But, we put, when you're hospitalized now, you get these things put on your legs that kind of inflate and deflate over and over to prevent blood clots in the legs because, and I'm sure that they weren't using them in the late 60s. And I'm sure that we had people who were immobilized in bed for several days who developed a blood clot that went to their lung and killed them. So given the time period, and I think that it's possible that him just lying in bed for a few days could have been the source of this issue. I mean, and you mentioned that he had a chest injury from the car accident. So I think it's possible he could have just died.
Exactly. And so anyway, I just wanted to say the 2 things I had said. Kind of at the beginning of the story, I said, no evidence suggests foul play. Mm-hmm. And then I go on to describe stuff. And then Concluding, I say, though many of Foot's friends suspect or believe that his death was not accidental, the available evidence does not sustain the conjecture.
Right. No, you do say that. You do say that, but then there was also a lot of, without Foot, the some of the protests that had been planned did not happen. There was definitely consequences to his death that people who were annoyed with Foot would have been happy about.
Sure.
When I asked you to talk about Foot, you did a really good job of talking about where he came from and, giving sort of a thumbnail sketch of what brought him here and what inspired him. And I think that would give me an opportunity to ask about how you did interviews as oral history. And you made a point in your methodology of talking about trying to do oral histories of people, that you weren't really working as a traditional reporter and that you were doing something more. Can you talk a little bit about oral history and how you felt that it was different than traditional reporting?
Yeah. I feel as though, so I got trained up in the field of oral history at the university and worked in that office for about 10 years.
In Fairbanks, at UA Fairbanks.
UA Fairbanks, yeah. But I think it's fair to say that I had more sort of natural inclination and instincts in the journalistic realm than in oral history. And so the book, I think, is some kind of hybrid. And so in some places, I'm being much more like a journalist, and in others, more like an oral historian. So often, practitioners of oral history will steer clear of very controversial issues and make the whole experience pleasant. And whereas a journalist, particularly dealing with a public figure, is going to hold their feet to the fire. And I felt I was much more in that role. What I tried to do was, I would prepare with sometimes as many as 20 pages of outline. And I would prepare, particularly if it was somebody who I thought didn't want to give me the information. I would see it like a chess game, so that if I asked this, he could say A or B. If he says A, then I'll ask this. And if it's B, I'll do this. And so it fingers out like a complex tree. And then to have at the ready push back if I feel I'm going to get an answer that's a dodge, and including to have the documents at the ready to show exactly how it went, and so on. So what I tried to do was allow the interviewee, say this has the potential to be a hostile interview, the opportunity to frame the debate along the lines of his choosing, and sit back and let him roll. If when he's done, he hasn't addressed things I know to be material, then I'm going to bring them up, and often in the context of, I have read that scholars in this field believe, blah, blah, blah. And if I continue to get a dodge, I continue to needle in, bore in, and until there's no more room to go. But I felt that was my job. I wanted to not put them on the spot, not hurry them up, but not let them get away either.
Right. Well, it sounds like it worked most of the time, but it didn't work with Edward Teller. Which, by the way, I just think it was very exciting for me at the end to know that you had the opportunity to interview him in person, in real life. I mean, I guess, can you tell us a little bit about, that interview and what it meant to you going into it?
Yeah. So naturally, I prepared like crazy for the interviewing this eminent.
I guess just to remind listeners, this is the architect of Project Chariot. I mean, this is the main player.
Yeah. And I think arguably the most influential scientists in the 20th century. Because whenever a Republican held the presidency, Teller's stock rose radically, and he gave us such things as the Star Wars missile defense system, which has, modified over the years to be what we've got now, National Missile Defense, or whatever the term is this year. And he was just such an ardent Cold Warrior that he was very influential in anything to do with nuclear matters whenever there was a Republican president. So anyway, I did all my my preparation, and we were going to take a film crew down there. Yes, that's when we still thought we were making a movie. And so I had a camera guy and another guy from the TV station, public TV station. We interviewed him in his hotel in Anchorage, and he was, first of all, late. And then second of all, he took a call, which we spent a lot of time with. And so our little window of access to him was shrinking. By the time he was available to us, we had maybe a half an hour. And I had him sign a release, and I kind of made the calculated decision to go for the stuff I most wanted because my time was running out. Normally with oral history, and I always follow this practice, I start way back, like with the person's forebears, and work your way through their biography a bit to get to where you're going to things of greatest interest to you at the moment. And often that's a very productive line of questioning too. So anyway, I just kind of went right for it and started asking him about what he was doing in Alaska at that time, late 80s, was promoting missile defense systems to be based on the North Slope of Alaska. They would be some kind of laser apparatus that theoretically could intercept missiles. So I felt like, well, here you got another high-tech, defense-related, nuclear-related project proposed for Alaska, if Alaska will agree to it. I thought, well, that has a lot of similarities to Project Chariot. So I was asking them stuff like, in light of your experience with Project Chariot up here, how do you sort out this present? How should Alaskans sort out your present proposal and stuff like that? Well, he hit the roof immediately. He wasn't inclined to take questions like that. And he just...
Because he didn't want to talk about the current project, or because of the implied negativity of the way things had gone with Project Chariot?
I believe that, and I'm speculating, but I believe that he was a very savvy person with respect to handling the media, the press, filmmakers, as a PR person, very savvy. And I think he couldn't find a way to talk about the new one and Chariot in the same breath, because Chariot had been a bit of a debacle. And it was his feeling, he had said it in a speech at the same visit, I think, that Chariot was needlessly canceled. The Russians went ahead and we did not. And basically said it was environmentalists who killed it senselessly. He didn't mention that the Russian program that continued polluted vast areas horrifically. So anyway, I think that he did not want to talk about Chariot at all, and there was no way to spin it that wouldn't end up doing damage to his current proposal, and that was the thing foremost in his mind. So he totally hit the roof, and first he asked if we could shut off the machine. That's how canny he is. So they shut off the machine. I wish they'd have let the audio roll. But then he detonated, and he was swearing at me, and he was saying, your questions are, seem to be polite, but they're substantively rude. You're saying, if in effect, have I stopped beating my wife? When did I stop beating my wife? And blah, blah, blah. And I'm thinking, hey, wait a minute. I know what that fallacy is, and I didn't do it. And what else? There's a tape recorder sitting right here to prove I didn't do it. How could he have the chutzpah to say something he knew wasn't true, I knew wasn't true, to my face like that? So it was quite interesting, I thought, to see his methodology in practice. And I kept saying, I think these are fair questions that people of Alaska now and in the future would like an answer to. And he said things like, I had a wonderful interview this morning with a reporter, and she let me talk about anything I wanted. And I felt like, well, we've heard everything he wants to talk about a lot of times, but we haven't heard his feet held to the fire on Project Chariot. And that was my job, I felt. So anyway, we got maybe 8 minutes of audio with him before we had to turn the machine off. And then there was a really interesting part to this where after we turned the machine off and I made my case, he just sat back and closed his eyes. And then, he just sat there for a long time and minutes were rolling by. And, I think my colleagues and I are looking at each other like, did this guy fall asleep? He was pretty old then. And then up would jump our host, who was a businessman leader in Anchorage. And he'd say, Dr. Teller is tired. I insist you leave. And of course, I wasn't going to move unless Teller kicked me out. And then Teller would rouse and snap at the guy and say, I am not tired. I am thinking. And then he'd go back and he'd close his eyes. And again, it's just minutes and minutes. And we thought, now he's got to be asleep. And I guess he wasn't, because he snapped at this. The guy jumped up again and said, Dr. Teller's my guest, and I insist you leave. And again, I just waited, and Teller lashed into him again, and we repeated this, I don't know, maybe 3 times. And I imagine he was going through the chess game like I need a paper and pencil to do, but he could probably do it in his mind. And there was no line that would accommodate what he wanted to do now and reconcile what he had done then. There was no good spin to put on this. And so then about the 4th time the guy insisted we leave, Teller did not resist, and one of the guys I was with turned off and started packing up the camera. And then that was it. So, and then as we were going out, just before the door slammed, I heard tearing up the release. He had asked for it back, and he tore it up. So the recording is still in the archive. I think anybody could listen to it. And I think they would find my questions were fair, just not ones he wanted to handle. But we have never allowed publication of it because he not having the release.
Even after his death?
Yeah, to me, I'd err on the side of the public's right to know, but the archivists tend to be pretty cautious about that stuff.
So speaking of the public's right to know, you did a lot of FOIA requests to write this book, and you wrote in the methodology about, and we've talked about it a little bit, about the arbitrariness of classifying documents. But one thing that you said that was a little bit interesting was that you started this project in the late 80s. The first edition of the book was 1995. Is that correct?
94.
But you made the point that I guess the afterword in my edition came during the Bush presidency, that you felt that you probably couldn't have written the book during the George W. Bush administration because they weren't responding to FOIA requests and they were classifying even more material.
Yeah, when Clinton got in, and I think it was Hazel O'Leary he put in charge of DOE, Department of Energy.
Which, for listeners, the DOE is what became of the AEC, correct?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so the Department of Energy then began doing a lot of declassification. So thousands and thousands of documents became public under Clinton. And again, scholars have been trying to get these things for years and years because it's our right to our history. And there are legitimate reasons to classify to do with national security, our methods and means of espionage, privacy rights of citizens, so on. But typically, or often, these classifications were being used to protect the public image of the agency. It had more to do with embarrassment and image management than it did national security, and you could show it so. Then when Bush came in, who was his guy, Ashcroft?
Yes, Attorney General.
And then he sends out a memo to all the agencies that if you resist FOIAs, we'll back you at the DOJ. And so that's what became the norm. You were just routinely denied. And even under Clinton, when it was more relaxed, you still waited years for this stuff. The law says you have to give it to you in like 7 days or something, 10 days. Maybe you can get a like extension, but routinely you wait years. And it's just a rigged system. You go to the National Archives, get into the AEC's stuff, and the people there, you want so simple a document as the minutes of an AEC meeting, commission meeting. And if even one word in the entire transcript is classified, you'll wait years for that one word to be blacked out and then mailed to you. And they'll have another way to summarize the procedure than that. But that's the upshot. So it's very hard to do research on that kind of timeline.
Right. Well, I want to talk more a little bit about the journalists who were working at the time. And when I got to page 186, you introduce Albro Gregory, who was a journalist who was writing for papers in Ketchikan, Nome, and you do such a great description of him as a typical Alaskan, and you have, in fact, maybe just read. You quoted him talking about his approach to life and to journalism. Will you read that blowout quote on page 186?
Albro Gregory said, "I'm just proud as hell to be an Alaskan. I can't stand to hear people say nasty things about Alaskans. I tell them all, usually in pretty plain language. People usually say what they think here, whereas down in the States, they pussyfoot about everything. I love the newspaper business, especially where I can write the editorials and say what I think. I know I'm loved and hated all over.
Okay, so as I was reading this, I was getting excited, thinking, oh, this is a journalist who's going to blow this up. But that is not who he was. That is not what he did. And you contrast him with another journalist, which is Snap.
Yeah.
Snap, who helped to found the Tundra Times. So I'm wondering, and I'm of course flipping pages trying to find where to introduce Snap, and I can't. Yeah, and you could just talk about, like, compare and contrast the types of journalists working in Alaska at the time, and why somebody like Albro Gregory was such a disappointment, whereas and yet we had a hero. We had journalists who were heroes at the time.
Yeah, so you get the sense that Gregory is kind of this hell-bent leather, tough guy, newspaper man, sitting in the bars with his cigarettes and stuff. And he was that kind of guy. He died just before I got on to working, but I found his wife was alive, and I talked to her, and I kind of said, I want to be kind of tough on the men here because, here's the kind of stuff he was saying. And she told me that's how he was. So that's one thing. But Tom was around, and I met Tom, and he was something.
Tom Snap.
Tom Snap. He was small. He was very soft, pudgy, very, very white-skinned, red hair. He was probably maybe about 70 by the time I met him. And he had a little tiny hand. We shook his hand. It was ready to go. He had no grip. It was just dead. And so contrast that with, burly old Albro Gregory. But Tom Snap was 1,000 times tougher and a real hero, I think. He had guts, that guy. And so he he fought everybody. And he ran the All Alaska Weekly for quite a while, and he didn't care. He offended. If he had the stuff, he let rip. And here's an example of him, which I think is amazing. So I went to go interview him, and he lived in a hotel in Fairbanks, an upper story. And so I found my way up there, carrying my tape recorder, and I knock on the door. He says, "Who is it?" I say who I am. He says, "Just a minute." And then he rummages around a bit. And then after a while, he opens the door. I go in. And so I'm looking around for where to sit down and set up. And he says, "Here at the kitchen table." Well, the kitchen table was small, and it was full of stuff. I mean, a mound of, from edge to edge, 6 inches high, of just stuff of all kinds. So anyway, I kind of nestled my recorder in there, and we did this interview. And at about either 30 or 45 minutes, I hear this click. And I look around where it came from on the table, and here amid all this junk is his tape recorder, and he's tape recording me. So when I knocked on the door, he'd gone and set up the tape recorder, so I wouldn't notice it was him do it. And all that time, he was, making a little insurance policy against me saying something he didn't say. Writing about him in any way out of context or anything like that. And I thought, that is brilliant, and very like him. And so, but he battled for.
Can you explain how? Yeah, can you explain how he's helped start the Tundra Times? And I just thought it was interesting that Tundra Times had 2 articles about Project Chariot in their first issue.
Yeah, well, it did launch. It launched Tundra Times. So Tom felt badly that the newspaper, the Daily News Miner, didn't really cover Native affairs. They had some correspondence out in the villages, and when they would write in, the News Miner wouldn't edit and would publish any lapses of standard English. And it offended Tom to see that they weren't treated with more respect. I think that's fair to say. And so what Tom did was join the Air National Guard so that from time to time he could get a free trip out to villages. And then he would interview people and become known to people and report on their situation, their issues. And let's face it, there was really some pretty big emerging issues like their land claims was coming up. And then later Inupiat. And so Tom would cover these stories. So when the Native people coalesced at a meeting at Barrow in 1961, Tom wangled a chance to go up and observe and report on it. And he met Howard Rock. I can't remember the exact sequence of all this, but Howard Rock had been a resident of Point Hope, Eskimo guy, and he was interested too. So they palled around together, and Howard had been outside so long that he'd pretty much forgotten the Inupiat language. But from time to time, they each would hear their own names, Tom's and Howard's names, amidst all this Inupiat flying around the room. And so at a break, they were, really curious as to what's going on. Why are we being mentioned? And it turned out that the delegates to this meeting had wanted the establishment of a newspaper covered Native issues. They didn't mean a newsletter. They meant a real newspaper, and they wanted Howard and Tom to be part of it. And that's what came about. So,
thank you. We're getting towards the end of our time. I think it was in your acknowledgement section, you acknowledged and apologized, thanked and apologized your son, Kyle. I imagine, and you could correct me if I'm wrong, that this must have been an all-consuming project for a really long time. I mean, can you just talk about like the project of writing this particular book and what it meant to you and how much of your life it occupied?
We should go in and ask my wife. it's harder for me probably than for one of them, although Kyle was pretty little. But yeah, I'm pretty sure that I latched onto it like a terrier, and it was the central part of my work, my activities outside the family, for the better part of 7 years. It was a 7-year span, and I think just eyeballing, I probably put in 4 full-time years. In the meantime, I built a cabin or two, stuff like that in the summers, but pretty intense work for all those winters. And
Did you ever think it was too big of a project?
yes, but the beginning. Well, I had never written anything over like about 7 pages until, including all of college, until I wrote about Chariot, and that was a whopping 14 pages. So all of a sudden I pitched a book and they called my bluff, and now I had to produce something of about 500 manuscript pages. And I mean, just even organizing that, conceptualizing the structure of that, when you have both themes and you have chronology, and there's a lot of potential ways to cover it. And I was a rookie at all of that. And I just sort of did the best I could. And it passed editorial review with, I was at St. Martin's Press for the first book, and had pretty good editors. They kept changing. And it apparently was acceptable. But it certainly, and I kind of tend to be that way whenever I sink my teeth into a big project. All my friends will be sick to death of me talking about it until the damn thing's done.
Mm-hmm. You said that you wrote a little something in the past couple of weeks. So this project, has stayed with you till now. How do you think about this project now?
Let's see. Well, it is amazing how interest in the story has been sustained, and it still sells books, and I still get calls, and so yeah. So now I'm doing this other little paper, kind of for a pal who's doing a section in the journal, and but I think one of the things that kind of I never thought of, Juno scholar mentioned, is that what I was working on essentially with the Firecracker Boys book was what we call today environmental racism or environmental justice. So that's kind of a theoretical framework in which you might place the Chariot story. But that framework had not been articulated. But it was kind of motivating me. But I'm not saying that I encountered overt racism on the part of the proponents of Project Chariot. People were more or less polite and more or less respectful outwardly. But it's hard to believe that at some level, the Native people weren't being taken advantage of because they were Native people. I think that's kind of impossible not to be the case. So this book now does fit within that framework pretty well. So that's something else it did.
Well, I have to thank you so much for all 3 interviews. They're so important. There's so much that I wanted to talk about that we didn't get to, but I am really grateful, Dan O'Neill, for all your time and for doing this, and for writing the books, because they're so important.
Well, thanks very much, Andrew. I really appreciate your interest and that of your listeners. Are they viewers or listeners? Viewers.
Listeners.
And good luck in the legislature. I'm going to be watching.
Big thanks to Corey Coolidge for making this podcast listenable. Please check out his website, anchoragelife.net, and his YouTube channel, also called Anchorage Life. And thank you to you, our listeners. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, rate, and review us.